How do I know where the people are?
They're filling in now. It seems
They're filling in. Do you see them?
Yeah, I see
you.
participants.
I
It's
see.
growing.
Okay. Now I see it. Welcome, women, to today's webinar, Language and the Values that Underlie Our Movement. A conversation with women's rights activists Julia Long, Eliza Mondegreen, Kara Dansky, Jesika Gonzalez, and Amanda Stulman. Dr. Julia Long will be facilitating. She is a British lesbian feminist who believes that truthful language is crucial to understanding and rejecting transgenderism. She has a background in research and activism against male violence, including pornography and femicide, and she is a contributor to the WDI webinars and Radical Feminist Perspectives series. Thank you so much, Julia, for all of your important work on this issue and for your willingness to guide this discussion today.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to get started then. Yep, okay. Thank you so much, Austin, and the others of you for inviting me. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. As I've already said, it's very generous of you to have a Brit hosting this on the 4th of July. So I think there's a great spirit of transatlantic cooperation there. So I'm really, really pleased to be hosting this because it is a topic that is very, very dear to my heart, and I'm sure it is to you too. So I'm just going to begin by introducing the speakers, just in the order that I have them here. So first off, we have Eliza Mondegreen, who is a graduate student who researches and writes about the topic of gender identity. We also have Kara Dansky, who is a public speaker, writer and consultant who is committed to protecting the rights, privacy and safety of women and girls on the basis of sex in law and throughout society. And I had the very great pleasure of meeting Kara back in February of 2019, where we had a pretty amazing week of actions and meetings. So that was it's really fantastic to be sharing this discussion platform with you again, Kara. Kara is the author of The Abolition of Sex: How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls. She's the president of the US chapter of Women's Declaration International. She was on the board of the Women's Liberation Front, WOLF, from 2016 to 2020, and she's also an attorney with a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and a BA from Johns Hopkins University, and she has an extensive background in criminal justice law and policy. Next, we have Jesika Gonzalez. Jesika describes herself as an ordinary working class woman and founder of the TERF Collective, which is an organization pursuing guerrilla approaches to fighting transgender ideology. The collective hosts TERF nights, semi-weekly chat sessions with gender-critical women and radical feminists from all over the world. And these sessions bring together decades-long activists and also those, along with those newly peaked in wide-ranging conversations. I must say, these sessions sound absolutely fantastic, Jesika. They discuss the impact of gender ideology and protest actions, and participants are also invited to imagine a future free of the impositions and requirements of patriarchy. So they sound extremely exciting. Finally, we have Amanda Stulman of Keep Prison Single Sex. Amanda is the United States Director of Keep Prison Single Sex, which is a UK-based organisation dedicated to ensuring single-sex incarceration facilities and accurate crime-related data collection. So what a lineup. I think we are going to have some really interesting and stimulating conversations this evening, or this lunchtime actually, where you are, this evening for me. So as the broad topic is language and values that underlie or underpin our movement. And we're gonna, my understanding is that we're gonna have a pretty specific focus on language in relation to analysing and combating gender identity ideology, transgender ideology. Even we get into issues of language as soon as we start to even talk about it, don't we? But given that that's our brief, I wondered if we might begin, if I could ask each of you to say something about your own particular approach to these questions of language, maybe in relation to the work that you do. Maybe you could say something about how important questions of language are to you, and if you've experienced any particular difficulties or challenges in this area. And I wonder, I mean, maybe Kara, as you've written a book, you had that particular challenge of how to write about this topic, you know, in that format. I wonder if maybe we could open with your thoughts on that and the challenges that brought, please.
Sure, and thanks so much, Julia, for doing this. It's great to see you again as well. Specifically with respect to the book, I will say that I did my absolute best to be very disciplined, use language that tracks women's ability to talk about ourselves as a sex class, and never to use the language of the opposition at all, other than to put it in quotes. And when I submitted the draft, I will confess that I was terrified that I would get feedback from the publisher telling me that I was required to use people's so-called preferred pronouns. And I did not get that pushback at all. I was delighted that the publisher's suggested edits to the text were minimal and did not question my use of language at all. So that was not a challenge. That was a very welcome response to the book that I wrote. So I think that this is a critically important topic. I think that the language that we use is so vitally important, specifically because it expresses the values that underlie the movement to protect women's and girls' rights as a sex class. So the language is absolutely critical, and it reflects the values that I think we all want to be espousing and promoting. I don't know if this is a challenge or part of my commitment to discipline in language, is that I have said this during feminist question time, I don't like to use words whose meanings I do not know. And I don't have any idea what a gender identity even is. And I try to make the case in my book that the very word transgender was invented in order to sell ordinary Americans, but also everyone across the world, on the idea that the material reality of biological sex doesn't exist. And if I'm right about that, if transgender was just invented to persuade people that sex isn't real, then I think it's a mistake to use it. And I'd love to hear what other panelists think. One of the biggest challenges I have encountered in this work is people do still feel incredibly coerced to use that kind of language, even people who want to push back. So just very briefly, and then I'll hand it back. I was having a discussion with a group of conservative women, and one of them said, Kara, how are we going to handle the problem of transgender athletes in women's sports? And I paused and I said, okay, I have some advocacy ideas, but first, what do you mean by transgender athlete? And she paused and she said, I guess I don't know what I mean by that. And I said, okay, do you mean men and boys? And she said, well, yes. And I said, well, then you can just say men and boys. And she said, I will never forget this. She said, I didn't think we were allowed to say that. So this is a conservative woman who was on our side in protecting the sex-based rights of women and girls. And even she felt that she was under a tremendous amount of social pressure to use the language of the opposition. That's what we're up against. Thanks, Julia.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example, I think. I wonder maybe if I could go to Jesika next. Jesika, would you like to, maybe particularly if you want to say anything about how this topic is discussed in the TERF collective sessions? I'd be interested to hear that, but whatever you want to say.
Sure. So thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's really a great honor and a privilege to be here, and very nice to see all of you again or for the first time. So at TERF Collective, within our meetings, we tend to be pretty strict. We call men, men, and women, women. We refer to people in the classic.
Oh, can't hear. We lost the sound. Can others say?
Something has
lost the
happened
sound.
to Jessica's sound.
Her mic appears to still be on according to Zoom, so there might be a problem with her hardware.
Now it's muted.
Now it's muted. Ah.
It's slowly faded out, like something muffled it.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Jesika.
Maybe try joining again.
Any better?
Oh, there it goes.
Oh,
yeah,
that's
there it goes.
yeah, perfect.
Sorry about that. That's something I should have known from yesterday. So I'll start again.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry about that, everyone. So like I was saying, at TERF Collective meetings, we tend to be pretty strict. So newcomers to our meetings are sometimes coming from a place of using more generic language, and we kind of gently prod them and correct them that no, we don't call men trans women here. We don't call women trans men here. We certainly don't oblige people in this notion of a preferred pronouns. This is a safe space for TERFs. So, you know, we really adhere to biological sex. But something I wanted to comment on, being that we are an organization that was.
Jesika, it's fading again.
It looked like she may have said, "Come back to me."
Yeah, okay, we'll do that. Okay, so I don't know, maybe Amanda, can we go to you next then? And we'll come back to Jesika.
Sure. I actually do want to start by saying I think it's really appropriate that we are on July 4th talking to someone who, nationally speaking, is a big sister, because on this issue, particularly on the issue of language, the UK really is ahead of us in this discussion. And you all seem to have, I wouldn't say hashed it out, it certainly isn't resolved, but the discussion was explicitly had. And I think history has shown that those of you, Julia Long, who were very strict on this from the start have been proven right, that having opened the door, it opened the door to a lot of other problems. So having said that, in the States, Kara hit on something that for me is one of the most troubling problems in terms of language, which is, you know, Kara identifying that people can't say what is gender identity. When you look in the various laws that have been put forth here, whether it's the pending proposed Equality Act, whether it's the prison law in California, whether it's laws in different states, if they define gender identity at all, which many of them don't even bother trying, which is extraordinary in a statute when really what every word means informs the entire rest of the document, that if they ever do deign to define gender identity, it is the most circular roundabout definition. Gender identity means the identity people feel about their gender. And I'm essentially paraphrasing. It's never much more than that, which I think just speaks to the lie of the concept that even when you're trying to define it, even in those rare instances when people legally feel sort of forced to do it, they can't. It's just sort of a mirage of a concept. So in the universe of what my organization does in terms of trying to track laws and to track data, that this concept is so squish and so non-specific, trickles into everything. And it results in not being able to actually see what you're looking at and to have meaningful data, because everything that it's based on is just feathers. The issue of language, I think, is the foundational issue of this whole fight, that it's really won or lost on this battlefield. And we are multiple steps behind because we have ceded so much language already.
That's really interesting to hear your perspective about the difference. I don't know. I think in the UK, I think definitely there are. It's really hard to generalize, because maybe it's the same in your context as well. You know, there are so many different groups and different perspectives, and it's hard to kind of really get a handle on a general kind of direction of travel in relation to these questions. So I really hope that you're right, and that, you know, things have kind of moved on in the direction of speaking more truthfully, you know, in the way that Kara was suggesting, and to be very honest about. I mean, I think that's a really, I just love that honesty of saying, I don't know what this means, and I don't like using words that I don't know what they mean. From what I see, it's almost now, from my particular sort of, you know, viewpoint, it's almost as though there's a kind of a two-tier thing, I think, in this country, where there, you know, because there has been quite a lot of publications, there've been, you know, various groups set up, various, you know, legal cases and things like that, but I think that there's possibly a bit of a split between some of this very kind of overt, visible political work that's going on, and then some of the women who at kind of grassroots level are really objecting to all the kind of using, you know, she pronouns for men, and you know, this kind of thing. So I think, generally speaking, there are more women now who are conscious of just how much of a problem it is. But I don't know, it seems to me that there is still quite a kind of normalization of using the language of transgenderism, you know, in trying to combat it as well. So I don't know, I kind of see both, but maybe we can come back to that. Sorry, I'm talking too much already.
Could I just jump in to address that? I know we want to move on to Eliza. But
sure, and then Eliza I'll come to you in a sec. Yeah, sure, Kara.
Really quickly on that, one of the ways in which our countries are differently situated is that you have a GRA, which means that, like it or not, and I know that none of us like it, it's there, which means that there, in the UK, there is a category of people who have a GRC. Probably most of us would like that not to be the case, but nonetheless it is. And so I actually want to disagree with Amanda a little bit. I feel like I see a lot of UK women still using words like trans women. And I think that what they mean by that is the category of men who have a GRC. I don't know, I might be reading it wrong, but that's sort of how I've interpreted the UK women's use of the word trans women. Someone's asking what's a GRC. I mean, my understanding, it's a gender recognition certificate, which a person can get under certain circumstances under UK law. Julia knows more than I do about that.
Yeah, that's true. I think, I mean, this would be I think this might be a really interesting thing that we can all sort of talk about once everyone's had their initial initial contribution. I think that use of the term trans women, and I'm kind of inclined to agree with you, Kara. I think I still see it a lot. I think the use of the term trans women isn't restricted to those to so-called gender critical. I'll probably be doing this a lot because some of these words you have been, you know, put in inverted commas. I don't think it's restricted to those with the GRC. I mean, there are, out of however many they reckon there are now of people identifying as transgender or non-binary or, you know, whatever it is. I think it's something like only about 5,000 have a gender recognition certificate. It's a really, really small number. And I think there's estimates of around 150,000, probably a lot more now because of the normalization of it in these past few years. So it's really small. And I think a lot of even gender critical women still use the term trans woman or trans women for men that they see as allies who may or may not have a GRC. There's I don't know if this is a kind of phenomenon over there, but I always find it quite amusing, really, that there's been a kind of a move amongst those groups who I find quite careless with their language, to make a distinction between trans woman as two separate words, or trans woman with a hyphen, or trans woman as one word, as if, really talk about, dancing on the, head of a pin. I don't have much time for that myself, but that's one of the things that I do see, the so-called gender critical groups and individuals putting trans women as one word rather than as two separate words, this kind of thing. Anyway, Eliza, sorry, we've kept you waiting there. What do you think about all of this?
So I have to say that language was the first part of the gender identity issue that attracted my attention back in about 2014. And I just remember volunteering at women's reproductive rights organizations in the United States, and just feeling this sense of constriction in women's spaces, talking about women's issues. And that sense of constriction was really the way in for me, because you can tell when the language that you are being instructed to use to be a good progressive, to be a very narrow idea of inclusive, you can tell when that language doesn't let you say what you need to say. It's like trying to run up a down escalator, which, having done this recently, is very hard. So I think the other thing that I really want to say about language is that our political opponents believe that language has magical properties to transform inconvenient realities. And I don't believe that language can do that. But what language can do is it can clarify or it can obscure what's going on. And when it comes to gender, the language that ultimately prevails, I think, is going to be the side that prevails. In other words, it's really like language cannot make a man into a woman. But as Amanda has argued, as Kara has said, like, language can make it impossible to make the case for sex-based rights, single-sex spaces. That's really the heart of it for me.
Thank you. Well, I think we seem to be showing some level of consensus about our feeling of how important it is. Jesika, how are you doing? Do we have you back on the audio?
I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. So go ahead. Go ahead. Hopefully it'll hold up.
So apologies, I feel like I missed a good deal of the discussion here that's happened so far with trying to deal with my audio issue, but if you can hear me, that's really great. And I would love, I don't know how much I missed, but I did want to mention the fact of acknowledging the need, though, to bridge a gap between women that are coming to this movement from a liberal feminist perspective and then eventually peak trans. And so I'm bringing up another problem and not a solution. And how do we bring these women into and get them to understand the importance of language? And how do we speak in terms that they will understand us? Because a lot of these women are used to saying trans women, trans men. They are used to obliging people they know and have affection for by their so-called preferred pronouns. So that is a challenge we face. So that's one of the biggest challenges we face. And then a second challenge we face is what I started to say is, because TERF Collective was born on the internet, was born on Facebook, which is a very highly censored platform. Another challenge we face is being able to use the language we know is correct in platforms that literally will not allow us to. They will literally remove us and prevent us from getting our message out on those platforms if we speak the truth. So I don't have a lot of solutions. I brought problems.
Mm,
But those are the things that we think a lot about. And, you know, we're not on their platforms if we're writing on, say, a Substack or in person to person in real life, then we can speak freely. We can't speak the truth most of the time, unless, of course, you're in a court of law, which is another place where you may not be allowed to speak the truth. So those are just two things that resonated, that came to mind when you were asking about what are the challenges we face. So that's my contribution here. Thank you.
okay. Thank you, Jesika. I think you raised really great questions, and I'd love to throw it open and see, you know, see what everyone wants to say. I think that question of communication is really crucial. Obviously, language can, as I think Eliza was saying, you know, it can be used to clarify, or it can be used to obscure. But I think we find ourselves in this kind of conundrum where it's really crucial to use truthful, reality-based language, but at the same time, the opposite of that has become the norm, and in many contexts is actually kind of made compulsory. So it puts us all into this conundrum as to how we negotiate that. And like one of the things that I've found in terms of my absolute conviction about the need to call men men is that that you can end up having to use quite a mouthful of words to talk about a man who demands that we pretend he's a woman, or, you know, whatever. And I can see why someone might want to use a shorter version of that, because it's quite cumbersome. But there is this, there's this question of how do we communicate? How do we even make clear who or what we're talking about if the norm has become this language that isn't based in reality, but it's based in kind of, you know, male fantasy? So I'm sure we've all had our different entanglements with this. Would anyone like to offer some thoughts on that? Amanda?
Again, going to the legal side of things, this is interesting in two different ways. One that ends up being kind of behind the scenes, and another that's more public and more significant. But the small way is that my organization in WDI worked on a nationwide FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act record request. And the way that we, and subsequently other records requests that my organization has made, we absolutely have to twist ourselves into pretzels about what we're talking about when we're asking for data about this group versus that group. Like obviously you can't just say men, they have no idea what we're talking about. We're not willing to say trans women. So we end up, Julia, as you pointed out, using 25 words to say something that should be one, but it's not. More significantly are in the US and in Canada, I don't know about the UK, there have been a number of cases where in courtrooms, people who have been testifying have been mandated to use trans women or she, her. The one that I think is probably the most significant in the US is in the sports context of a case in Connecticut where the high school girls' attorneys were required to refer to the high school boys who are running in their races as girls. And just from the jump, it taints the entire discussion. And you've, again, lost before you've won, you know, before you're even out of the gate on it. So there are the like face-to-face conversations that become challenging. There's the not getting banned from social media that's challenging. But then there's these like very technical, hyper meaningful issues that happen in the legal realm too, that I don't see. I mean, once you're in that position where a judge is saying, nope, they're girls, and it's like, well, what's my case then? My case is done if they're girls. It's over.
Absolutely. And I think, I wonder, Kara, if you might like to say a little bit about that, because I did. I remember, oh, was it maybe a month or a couple of months ago, hearing you take this on head on a media appearance. Do you know the one I'm talking about, where you absolutely halted the conversation and were really accurate about language? And I think that's one of maybe even the first time I've seen someone do that, you know, in that context, and it was absolutely fantastic. So I wonder, because obviously a lot of the time, particularly in the media, these questions or debates are always framed under, you know, as being about transgender rights, aren't they? So I think, as Amanda was saying there, that basically they set you up to fail. They set up to, you know, that you've lost before you've begun. So I wonder, I did see you take that on in a really fantastic way, Kara. So I wonder, you know, what you felt about that, or how you felt when you did it. I don't know, or repercussions for it. What do you think?
Thanks. I don't know which one exactly you're referring to, but you know, I tend to get in a lot of trouble for going on the Tucker Carlson show, and I understand why. But I did two things in two separate interviews that you might be pointing to, and one was this. It is one of my pet peeves that Republicans use the language of transgenderism. It drives me crazy. And if I have to resign myself to going on the Tucker Carlson show, I'm going to use that opportunity to educate his largely conservative, although increasingly liberal, including liberal audience. And I said, please stop saying transgender athlete, transgender prisoner, transgender student. And the reason I took that opportunity to do that is because I honestly think that when the conservatives are using that language, they've lost the battle before they've entered the battlefield. So that's one of the things I did. Another thing that I did on a subsequent show, which was specifically about a case involving women who had gotten pregnant in a New Jersey prison because of men being housed there, is I said explicitly, the state is getting away with housing these men in prison by calling them transgender women. But the fact that these men are capable of impregnating women blows a hole through the lie that trans women are women, because there's no category of women who are capable of impregnating women. So I don't know if either of those is the example you're thinking of, but I try to be as explicit as I can in saying, you know, we're talking about men. And if states like New Jersey and the other 49 states that allow for this, would just say that they're housing men in women's prisons, the public would never stand for it, but they don't, they lie. As Amanda well knows, and as she's pointing out, I don't have a solution to Amanda's very specific and very real problem about how to do this when you're communicating with government entities that classify men as trans women. That's a really specific problem. I don't have the problem that Jesika has about communicating with women who are new to this discussion, because I'm just not really in those spaces. I know Eliza's got her hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, Eliza, yeah, what did you think?
Yeah, so just to respond to what Jesika brought up about needing to build a bridge to people still under some level of indoctrination, something that one of my research subjects is detransition, and something that you notice when you listen to detransitioners over time is that they will move through a process of whatever they decide to do physically. Like, there's a process of ideological detransition that is just as serious, probably more so, and they will often like follow a pattern from like, okay, I was wrong that I wasn't really trans, but that's still a real thing, and there are really trans people, and they'll often move closer and closer over time to like, I don't think this is a real thing that exists. And I bring this up because I think that there's an extent to which our societies, but especially our government in the United States, our progressive organizations need to undergo a process of ideological detransition too. They need to unlearn this language of transgender identities. They need to like pick apart what they're saying, and they have been encouraged at every turn by dictates on how to be a good ally to not think about this. And I think that one of the most important things that we can do when we are talking to people who aren't on the same page, who aren't there yet, is to help people, first of all, to notice when the language that they're being asked to use does not let them say the things that they need to say. And also to just model language use, I think that it's really contagious, and it's contagious whether you are modeling constriction of language and thought, as we so often experience in progressive spaces. And it's also contagious when you do not observe the taboos yourself. You free other people up to do the same and to reconnect language and reality.
Thank you. Eliza, maybe if I could just come in with it, as you were saying that, I was reminded I actually selected a couple of quotations that I felt were really relevant to today, and I'd like to bring them in here because you actually just, one of them is actually an Adrienne Rich quotation, but it's really almost what you just said there, and it comes from her essay Women and Honor, some notes on lying. I don't know if any or all of you may be familiar with this. If you're not already familiar, I really recommend it. I think it's such a profoundly thoughtful and challenging piece. Anyway, and it also, because she talks about lying and what for women, what lying does, the pressure on us to lie, the sort of patriarchal lies. Obviously she was writing this before the kind of trans attempt at takeover that we have now, but it going back and rereading this really made me think, actually one of the words that we can call these men is just quite simply a liar, because they're men who are lying. They're saying they're women and they're not. And I think there's something really really refreshing about the use of that kind of really direct term. But anyway, what you just said there, I think is pretty much what Adrienne Rich said, several decades back, that when a woman tells the truth, she is creating the possibility for more truth around her. And that's pretty much what you just said. And so I think that we can feel, certainly I've felt at different times, a certain pressure that, there's always this pressure, I think, to meet women where they are now and bring new women into the movement, and this kind of thing. And there can be a bit of an assumption that we should compromise our language in order to do that. And I think that is such a mistake, because as you were saying, I love what you were saying about the kind of social contagion aspect, that you can actually see in groups that, when women feel kind of obliged to use all this very compromised and very really sort of false, deceptive language, that as soon as one person refuses to do that, it's like the dominoes all kind of fall back the other way. And this short paragraph from that essay, I think, is so resonant as well in terms of our responsibility to each other, to other women. That she says, women have been driven mad, gaslighted for centuries by the refutation of our experience and our instincts in a culture which validates only male experience. The truth of our bodies and our minds has been mystified to us. We therefore have a primary obligation to each other not to undermine each other's sense of reality for the sake of expediency, not to gaslight each other. And I was thinking of that, Jesika, when you were raising that really crucial question about speaking to women who maybe are so steeped in this kind of language of falsity and of deception. And I think that's something that maybe we can try to hold, kind of in the foreground of our mind, that responsibility not to gaslight each other, even if those same women are kind of, sometimes it's quite physical, isn't it? You can actually feel pressure to use this fake language or patriarchal language. But I think those words of Adrienne Rich, and certainly, what you were saying, Eliza, really, to me, is a very compelling sort of counterbalance to that pressure. Amanda, did you want to come back? Was someone going to?
On a slightly different issue, just to throw out another word to smash around a little bit and give a hard time. The idea of, and someone was using it, in a context that made sense, but they used the phrase transgender rights. And even the word rights in this has I don't think we give the word rights enough hard time as part of that phrase in terms of challenging it, because what's being sought there is, for what my organization does, to be able to use showers and toilets and sleep with and feed of vulnerable women. Like, in what universe is that a right for a man? In what universe is it a right to be able to use locker rooms in public spaces? That the word rights has also been appropriated in a way that is it's so easy to accept that we're doing a balancing test, that what needs to be done is a balance between women's rights and trans rights. And once you sort of tease out what's being sought, it really puts a lie to the word rights in that context.
Does anyone, I totally agree. Does anyone want to come back there or offer any thoughts? Maybe just.
Can I say something very?
I can't see who.
Can I say something very quickly to that? I consider it a campaign for trans identifying supremacy, and I would invite anybody willing to join in popularizing that concept, because what is being sought here is well, maybe there is a right or privilege for these men that identify as trans whatever to breach our privacy and safety safeguards, to rape even. I mean, how many times haven't you seen, just in debates on the internet, women pulling up to defend men, the honor of men that are convicted sex offenders? I mean, these are the most flagrant offenders, rapists of children even, and they're like, well, you didn't call her by the right pronoun. These are men superior to other men even. So I consider it a campaign for trans supremacy and not trans rights. Since we're talking about language, that's some language I've been to using.
I'll just
thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Kara.
I'll just chime in. I agree with Amanda and Jesika completely. This is not a rights movement at all. And I try to make that point in saying that, I just, so many people still seem to think that there is a category of people called transgender people for whom sex isn't relevant and who are fighting a civil rights battle. That is like, we've lost. If that's what people think, then we've lost. And so I do my best to counter it. I also just want to throw out something of a challenge that I have been having, that a lot of women in our movement have started talking about a lot more, which is there does seem to be something, or maybe there's not, push back on me if women disagree with me. There seems to me to be something that is very different between a man who may or may not be an autogynephile, who is just lying about his sex in order to torture women, versus a teenage girl who is dealing with what it means to become a woman in a patriarchal society and wants to take steps to remove herself from that because it's painful. Those seem to me to be two very different scenarios. And I find myself challenged in terms of how to talk about that, because both categories of people are currently lumped into this word transgender. And I'm not sure how to deal with that.
Does anyone want to respond to Kara's question?
In terms of how it ends up playing out, some of the end game of that for me is similarly offensive. I think gay men in gay male spaces, they have a right to keep those too, and for people, for young women not to try to nose their way into that. So in that sense, the ultimate end game of that, obviously it's distinct, but there's some similar concept to it. But there's obviously a different emotional sympathy. Yeah, I imagine any one of us who's been through female puberty imagines there were moments where we would be like, well, if we could not do this, that would be all right. So for me, just on a personal level, I might have different feelings about the situation, but in terms of wanting to protect spaces and language, I end up in the same place. While I, have, again, different levels of sympathy, my landing spot ends up kind of the same.
I totally agree. I guess my difficulty is with society's use of the word trans. To include both categories of people, but totally, I mean, there's no such thing as changing sex. We all know that. And women have no right to invade the spaces of gay men any more than men have the right to invade our spaces. I'm just not quite sure how to handle it when it comes to communication and use of language, that there do seem to be, for the emotional reasons that you're describing.
I mean, one thing that I think is useful is to just remember the history of the development of this this kind of supremacist campaign. I absolutely love your use of that term, Jesika. I'm going to use it myself now. I think it's absolutely perfect. But it's in fact, it's very precise. It's absolutely, it's just really precise. I think that's exactly what they're doing. And I think if we remember the history of it, we know that this is, we can see it's a particular kind of permutation of patriarchy. It's a will for male domination. So it's men who've created the narrative. It's men who, both the men who wanted to pretend that they were women and make everyone else pretend that they're women, and also those men, the kind of megalomaniac, surgeons and endocrinologists who also wanted to play God and turn a man into a woman, etc. So I think, to me, that helps to make sense of these two scenarios where you have the autogynephiles and the sort of horrifically misogynist men and the young women, because these young women are now at a time of, of great a classic little time of great distress for women around our bodies, is that whole kind of shift from childhood, puberty, adolescence. It's a classic time of distress for women living under patriarchy, and so they're now encountering this narrative as a way of I don't know, rebelling or trying to make sense of it or escape it, or whatever it is. So I suppose, yeah, and I think the power distinction is very, very different from, because young women don't pose a threat to men in the way that these men pose a threat to women. I suppose I usually would say something like, men who demand that we pretend that they're women, and basically women who are deluded into thinking that they're men. I usually use that kind of distinction, but I don't know, I definitely would be open to other ways of talking about them. And I think, yeah, in terms of I think it's not to say that those women who also do want to pretend that they're men can't create huge problems and huge problems for other women. Some of the really sort of vocal individuals promoting the sort of trans supremacist agenda are also women who pretend to be men, and they can create a lot of problems for individual women, I don't know, in our places of work, in all kinds of different contexts. But I think, yeah, in terms of the distinction, it's men who've created this narrative, and I think sort of women, and maybe particularly young women, have been kind of caught up in the backdraft. But as I guess it's in some ways parallel to women who are pro pornography or something like that. Their relationship to the issue is different in terms of power, but they can still do a lot of harm. Yeah.
What that issue having raised that issue, Kara, might do? I mean, for me, in a certain sense, it reinforces that those are girls and young women, and these are men, because those words alone, those have some, I think they speak to some of the issues that Julia was just referencing, without kind of getting into the identifies as, deluded as, insists that we demand on this as, in some way. And I'm looking at the chat and people sort of getting into it over the specifics of it. And it's a really interesting question. And just everybody, while people were talking, I was thinking, well, now I'm even more committed to just saying those are girls and young women, and these are men over here, because in a lot of ways that embodies the power issues and other issues that were raised.
I wonder if maybe we could go back a little bit. I was making some notes on, I can't even remember now who was saying about that. I was making some notes on what was being said before that I thought might be really interesting for us all to think about in terms of the kind of, Jesika, maybe it was you actually that was talking about the whole phenomenon of social media and the very kind of censorious climate of those, and the fact that literally you can be booted off of certain platforms or banned for life from certain platforms. And I wondered if it seems to me that we're pretty much on the same page as regards how crucial these questions of reality-based language are, but I wondered what we think about different contexts and maybe the particular challenges that different contexts bring. We've heard a little bit about courtrooms, a bit about social media platforms. Maybe I was interested, Kara, that you didn't have this experience with your publishers, but other women have said that their publishers, basically enforced, preferred pronoun use. For those of us who are earning our livelihoods through, being employed by different public or private entities, workplace demands can be another thing. And then also there's the kind of context of just conversations with other women and maybe public meetings where we don't have this kind of threat of being banned, but at the same time we can be ostracized by other women or really demonized. Is something that I've experienced a few times over, of really being seen as a baddie for questioning the use of kind of preferred pronouns, etc. So I wondered what you all think about these different contexts, and maybe if you have any experience of particular challenges. If it's a very, very real threat for women that we could potentially lose our livelihood if we don't go along with it. So again, that's another aspect of this conundrum. I wondered if anyone had any thoughts or experiences on any of those scenarios.
I think something that applies both in the use of censorial social media platforms and very difficult social situations at work or with friends where you don't want to be ostracized is that if you don't want to get banned from Twitter, if you don't want to get ejected from, fired from your work, you can't always tell the whole truth, but you never have to lie. And so a way, if you can't say Laurel Hubbard is a man on social media, you can say Hubbard, don't use any pronouns, don't say woman, you can do things that allow you to move away from language that lies about reality. And you can do the same thing in real life. Just a kind of a Solzhenitsyn talks about as a non-participation in lies, as if you can't do anything else, do that.
Yep. Great point. Thank you.
I could jump in and say something about the employment context and preferred pronouns. So two things I would say about that. If anyone is being pressured to include so-called preferred pronouns, actually three things I'll say. I will just refer to people in the third person if necessary. I'll just use their name. If I have to refer to someone in the third person and they want me to use a pronoun that is an opposite sex pronoun or a they, them, or a Zer or whatever, I just won't do it. I'll just refer to their name, first or last. When it comes to pressure from employers to include so-called preferred pronouns, one thing I have been hearing recently, it is that it is actually transphobic to compel someone to include their preferred pronouns, because then you're compelling a trans person to out themselves. Now, we can all know that this is nonsense, but anyone who's being pressured to put their preferred pronouns in their email signature could probably get out of that by saying, you're making me uncomfortable right now because I'm still exploring. That might be a bullshit response, excuse my language, but it might get you out of having to put your preferred pronouns in your email signature. And then just the last thing I'll say is I am desperate And I know how risky this is. And I have to acknowledge I've lost everything I'm going to lose in this fight. So I don't have anything to lose at this point. But I am desperate for people to start putting things like Her Majesty as their preferred pronouns, or I don't know, Queen Elizabeth as their preferred pronouns, or, whatever, some completely outrageous thing, and then say, look, these are my preferred pronouns, and anyone who doesn't use them is offending me. I want people to start doing that. Anyone who feels like they can take a risk, please.
And maybe that contagion that Eliza was talking about might really come into play then with the increasingly colourful pronouns. I mean, my sort of very limited experience of this is that I think, I don't know how, this is just anecdotal, I don't know how sort of representative it is, that I see organisations over here, private and public sector organisations, being very supportive of people putting preferred pronouns into their signatures. I'm sure in some places it is kind of demanded as well. I've seen more that it's not demanded, but it's kind of seen as being a good thing, or that they support it. But what I do see being demanded is that we're all supposed to respect these preferred pronouns, and I don't really see too much conversation about that. In my experience, it's actually very easy to resist putting them in. I don't particularly want to talk about my workplace, but I think it's fairly typical in that it's there's a kind of thing from on high saying that we support people to do this, and then I haven't seen anyone actually do it. I think it's in lots of places it's quite easy to resist that. I don't know if that's the same in the States or not, but what I think is much harder is to resist being compelled to use them or to respect them. That I think that's the and I think that's really where the crunch comes, in my experience. And I completely agree. I can't remember if it was maybe yourself, Kara, or I think both you and Eliza were saying, yeah, you don't have to lie. You can just avoid using these terms, but it's all part of, I think, that conundrum between wanting to use reality-based language and the fact that very, very few of us are. Jesika, can I ask you, what about, you've said that, within the sessions that your group runs, that you're very clear about language. Do you kind of experience much pushback from that? Because I've certainly have experienced pushback from that, maybe less recently, but certainly over the past, 5-6 years, lots of pushback, things, the idea that using correct pronouns is discourteous, or these kind of things, or it's too trivial to be worried about. How has that kind of played out in your groups?
In our group, if you believe in the notion of preferred pronouns, you don't belong in our group. So there is no pushback, is what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. Now, the only thing is, of course, certainly when women newer to this space join, then they're a little bit, they might still be using preferred pronouns outside. There are some women in the group that may continue to use preferred pronouns because they feel it's a safe thing to do, for example, in their workplace or something like that. And I wouldn't know, because when you come to our meetings, you are on the side of reality, and that's non-negotiable. If there was somebody that came to our meetings and insisted on preferred pronouns and all this other transiting language, I would just consider them an infiltrator.
Jesika, we're losing the audio again. No. I'm afraid.
Oh no, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Maybe if you want to come back.
Maybe if so frustrating. Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. Is this any better at all?
I think that sounds better. It might go again. It starts to get very distorted.
Bandwidth where I am now. Yeah, the bandwidth where I am now is I'll have to work on that in the long term. But you know what I do? I want to talk about, I do want to really talk about what are we going to do about censorship in social media. And I think we need to get serious about launching some kind of a major campaign against that, because of course, being censored in our individual lives is serious, it's troubling, it's difficult. But when we're censored on the major social media platforms, we lose access to the instrumentalities of mass communication. We lose access to the edge that the other side dominates. And so I would love for us to work out ways to become effective and devise campaigns that will get those platforms to acknowledge that we have the right to use this language, which is real language. And it's not harassment or threat of violence or anything like that to call a man, or a woman. Certainly if you're not targeting a person individually and you're just speaking very generally, you know, I don't know who it would harm for me to go on, you know, Turf Collective Twitter and say Laurel Hubbard is a man, just very generally. I think we need to try to fight that harder, to be honest with you. And that's something I think more about than individually in the workplace. Although, you know, in the workplace could become more of an issue for me in the future. I've been able to avoid it so far. And I really would love for us to focus on being able to communicate our message on a larger scale, which we are hampered by being so highly censored on social media.
Would anyone like to offer any thoughts on that?
I mean, the only thing I would say is, first of all, I have no idea how to do that, Jessica. I mean, yeah, absolutely, that would be great. I don't have the tools or the knowledge to know how to do that. And then I'll just say, I have no idea how I've managed not to get banned from Twitter. I have no idea. I mean, I had a 12-hour suspension one time because I said Laurel Hubbard is a man. And then they let me back on. And I mean, I'm just not well known enough, I guess, but I don't hold back on Twitter. So I have no idea why they haven't banned me yet.
I wonder whether some of it isn't, to Eliza's point, talking about sort of what's the norm. And like, if everyone at once started using the dirty word man, are they going to kick everyone off? Maybe, maybe. But maybe if there's a significant, if there's enough peer pressure, for lack of a better word, social pressure, just to say what it is, that maybe it's sheer volume that does it. If the organizations that own it, if the employees who are there monitoring this stuff aren't going to do it, I don't know either. That's the only thing I could think of, is just mass amounts. People.
What well, I'm only on Facebook, and I'm not even on Facebook very much at the moment, and I'm not on Twitter, so I'm probably one of the least qualified people to speak about this. But what do you think about kind of the use of alternative platforms? I do remember that, you know, hearing about some of these, but I don't know to what extent they've taken off or not. I think some of them at least are women run. What do you think? Do you think that's kind of the way to go, or have you tried any of those? Anyone?
I personally don't go into the smaller platforms because I think it kind of defeats the purpose. If we're trying to grow our numbers and then we go into a smaller platform where it's just our own little sandbox, which is great. You know, I love the idea of women that are already on this wavelength joining together to support each other and share ideas and things like that. And that's wonderful. But if I'm talking about, we need to spread the word outside of just, you know, the choir that already exists, then that kind of, in a sense, does defeat the purpose. So yeah, that's something I've been thinking about for a long time, is how do we get Twitter and Facebook to let us on and let us speak freely? I think the answer would be to get people that are too important for Twitter and Facebook to lose to defend us, basically. And that's a big ask. That's a very that would be a very challenging task, but that's really all I can think of.
I just want to throw out that I think Amanda's idea is a great one of reaching critical mass. But I also just want to throw out, you know, the Australian woman, Sal Grover, all she tried to do was start a female-only social media app. She wasn't even talking about trans. She just wanted a safe place for women to be able to talk about issues that women confront. And some guy tried to get in there and she wouldn't let him. And so he took her before the Human Rights Commission of Australia, which she's dealing with now. And I agree with Jesika too. If we're going to reach the masses who are with us, we have to be able to communicate using the larger platforms.
I mean, I'm sure, well, I imagine that you're aware over there of the fact that it was Kelly J. Keane and Venice Allen, I think, to begin with, but now pretty much Kelly J. Keane has kind of single-handedly been tramping up and down the country with various speakers and flags and banners, and kind of getting women to come out and speak out and reclaim the public square. So that's something that is, I must admit, I really much prefer to go and meet, you know, a couple of hundred women at Hyde Park, or, you know, some similar kind of public venue like that. And I think that has worked extraordinarily well here. Obviously, we're talking about a much smaller country than, you know, than where you all are. So I don't know quite, you know, what you think about that, but I think that has been really remarkable in terms of creating a space where women can speak far more freely. It's not compulsory to speak, but there's every opportunity, and you see women who haven't come along before speaking, and it just is such a powerful thing. And I think that is one way of creating those spaces where women can kind of take back that energy and that kind of exhilaration of speaking honestly with other women, take that back to different, you know, wherever they live, wherever they work. And I think that really does help to build things away from, you know, what are kind of inevitably these really male dominated, really patriarchal platforms like Twitter and Facebook. So that's something that has been fantastically successful here, and, you know, in an ongoing way. I don't know if you've seen any of that. Obviously, that they get live streamed, so they go on YouTube. I don't even want to say in case it invites it, but, you know, that's obviously pretty crucial, the fact that they can then be shown on YouTube. So that's another platform that I guess that we're pretty reliant on. Have you seen much of that? And is there anything at all like that happening? I've seen some kind of speak out type things over there, but obviously we're talking about, you know, huge distances and kind of small numbers spread across these huge distances over there. Anyone want to?
Yeah, I watch her live stream every time I can. Yes, a lot of that is happening here. It just gets a lot less coverage. So there were women who gathered in Madison a few months ago. Many of them are here. Marie Long is noting that women have gathered in Chicago and Milwaukee. Yes, so it happens. It's just much less visible. And I think one of the things that's so brilliant about it is she just frames it as being about women speaking, right? So when the enemies, like what happened in Bristol, when the enemies come and like try to attack women speaking, they show themselves to be the misogynists that they are. And I think brilliant framing on her part.
Yeah, and very, very truthful. Not even really framing, but just very truthful. It is about women speaking. That's what it is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Any more thoughts on the whole kind of issue of censorship on social media? Otherwise, we'll maybe move on to some other questions. Eliza, did you want to say anything on that, or are you happy to move on?
Happy to move on.
Happy to move on. Okay, so I've made a note of a few terms. I know beforehand we were talking about some of these terms that I think really serve as these kind of crux issues for that really show a very, very, show the differences in politics with, within the broader movement. Kara, I know you raised the question of this term gender critical, and I wonder if we wanted to share some views on that. I have some quite strong views on that particular term, but it is a term that we're certainly over, this side of the pond, we see it a lot. It's used, I think, as a kind of shorthand to refer to women who, in the very mildest way of putting it, have concerns around transgender ideology. But I think within that term, it kind of encompasses a very, very wide range of politics, and some of us reject that term altogether. Like I personally reject it, whilst at the same time it does have this status now of being that gender critical beliefs are protected beliefs now under law. So it does have its use in that sense, but it's just a shame that it is a rather I find a rather insipid, and I find it quite it's one of these terms that is, I think, fairly dishonest, actually. Fairly, in my view. I could say a bit more about that maybe. What do others of you think about that term gender critical? And if you think it's useful, then why? Or if you have criticisms, what are they? Eliza, maybe I haven't heard from you so much lately.
Oh, I was actually hoping to sit back for a few minutes on this one.
Oh.
It's not actually something that I've thought a whole lot about.
Oh, okay, sure, no problem. Anyone? I mean, I'm more than happy to talk about my objections to it. Shall I do that? Throw them out and see what you think? Yeah. So where do I start? I suppose I think I've got two main objections. One is that do you use this term wishy-washy over there? Is that real British? I don't know, that's one of these really British over there. So I think it's just so wishy-washy. I think if we are anti-pornography, we say we are anti-pornography. If we are anti-racist, we say we are anti-racist. If we are anti-capitalist, we say we're anti-capitalist. If we're anti-male rights. So why then, when we have transgenderism, or what now is sort of being referred to as gender identity ideology, why do we suddenly become so timid? And when I say we, I'm talking about the wider movement. Why do we suddenly become so timid and just say we're gender critical? I just find it really pathetic. I don't find it, I find it lacks any kind of conviction, it lacks any kind of clear politics, and it lacks the kind of drive that you need to create the kind of movement I think that we're talking about. I just think it's very, very weak and far too cautious. To me, the term gender critical, or women who describe themselves as gender critical, are the same kind of women who start anything they say on media by saying, I support transgender rights, or I'm not transphobic, but blah blah blah. That's, to me, it's part of that whole vocabulary of timidity that I absolutely reject. The other thing that I think is really dishonest about it is that when people use that term, or when women use that term, do they actually mean they are thoroughly critical of gender across the board? Are they critical of femininity, of masculinity? Are they critical of all the kind of practices of gender? Are they critical of, or maybe they're a little bit critical of some of these things, but the kind of groups and individuals that I see really popularizing this term gender critical, to me, don't seem to be very critical of kind of patriarchal notions of gender at all. And if we are, again, are we just critical of them? Do we not totally reject them? Do we not reject gender as being a key kind of instrument of patriarchal oppression? It's the way that the male domination and female subordination is thoroughly kind of naturalized and normalized. So anyway, that's my that's my frustrations with those are my frustrations with this term. But anyone have any other thoughts about it?
Yeah, I don't.
The term you use, Julia. I'm sorry. What do you like to use?
I don't, to be honest, I don't really feel a need to ever use a term as a substitute for that. I just don't use it. I guess if someone asked me, I would say I'm anti-transgender, but even that is kind of reifying the notion of I'm anti-transgenderism, anti-transgender ideology. I don't really ever find myself in a situation where I kind of have to use the term. I think, there's a great phrase that I first heard uttered many years ago by Sheila Jeffries, is that she said that she was a conscientious objector to gender. I find that far superior, much more energetic, robust sort of denunciation of gender than just gender critical. But I don't really feel the need to ever use it. I do think there is a potential issue now that we have these so-called like gender critical beliefs protected, because if we, it means that other beliefs, not that any of it is a belief. I mean, it's not a belief that there are, you know, men and women, there are women and men. That's not a belief, but it is a term now that I think has some kind of use within workplace scenarios where women might want to say that they are gender critical or have gender critical beliefs, because it's now seen that's seen as a belief that is worthy of respect in a democratic society. But I don't know, it's just, I think it's just a way that the law kind of cements things in that are often really, you know, kind of half-baked solutions. But I can see that there is a value in terms of protecting women and our livelihoods in that. But outside of that context, I find it a really wet kind of description, and I'm a bit surprised as to how it's taken hold. I think it's I'm not exactly sure where it came from. In fact, does anyone know here where that term has come from?
I don't know where it came from. I do know that I used to use it specifically in the context of what was then called the Gender Critical Action Center. But I will also say that in creating the so-called Gender Critical Action Center, there was not a lot of critical thought given to whether it made sense to use the phrase. But I will say at this point, I'm just much more comfortable using the phrase gender abolition. And I want to say something that Lear Keith put in the chat, because I think it highlights why this is so important. Lear said in the chat, I'm not slavery critical, right? That's partly why the phrase gender critical is so weak. I'm not interested in criticizing slavery. You know, I want to get rid of slavery. And I just wanted to bring that here because I didn't want to get lost. I think it says so much about why the phrase gender critical is so weak.
Absolutely. And in some ways, maybe I wonder if maybe that's why it has become so popularized and normalized, because certainly in this country, there's been a lot of this kind of, in terms of some of the groups that have been set up and that have, you know, been very active. It was my experience of some of those groups, with the definite exception of Standing for Women, my experience of some of those other groups has been very much kind of like, don't frighten the horses, we've got to play this tactically, you know, we have to come across as a kind of, you know, very kind of nice and reasonable. And I think maybe that is why it's kind of caught on here, is because there has been a real, both a kind of an assertiveness in terms of setting up these groups, but I think a real timidity in terms of the basis on which those groups have been taken up, with notable exceptions, obviously, because anyone coming from a radical feminist perspective hasn't taken on that, you know, that kind of rather timid stance. But I do see it a lot in terms of those groups that see themselves as being very strategic and calling men trans women, etc. Any other thoughts on that particular term, gender critical?
So just in terms of any kind of legal significance it might have in the US, we don't have that same legal protection in our workplaces. So if we wanted a groundswell of something new, we could do that, ladies among us. because there's nothing significant to that in terms of legal protection, which does speak to a gap in our legal protection in the US, which is if we are able to describe the trans movement, I think accurately as in many respects, a cult movement, a religious movement, that opting out of that does offer in our workplaces potentially religious-based protection. That I don't believe that there's a gender spirit that you have that's different than your body. And I'm not subscribing to that. And I'm not going to use a different pronoun for you that suggests I buy into that. And you're forcing me to do that, is forcing me to profess a kind of spiritual religious belief that I don't share. That's the way we would have to deal with that issue here. But sticking with sort of the language issue, I suppose maybe like Eliza, I haven't given a huge amount of thought to it. It sort of seemed like it was a little bit of just the casual catch-all for this position. It's interesting to think about it. And I've enjoyed looking at the chat and seeing what people think about it. And I'm happy to give that more consideration. Thank you, chat.
Thanks. I just saw something in the chat about what time we're finishing. I don't know, Austin, are you still there behind that behind that logo?
So Eliza has to go pretty soon, and I was wondering maybe if we could wrap up by 2:30 and address these questions in the Q&A.
Sure, absolutely. Are there questions in the Q&A? I haven't been keeping track.
Yes, there are a couple.
And when you say, I'm slightly lost track of time. So when you say 2:30, like in about 10 minutes time, yeah?
Yeah, is that okay?
That's absolutely fine with me. Yeah, should I have a quick look in at the Q&A and see who wants to answer? Okay, so there's whoever we've only got 10 minutes left, so whoever wants to answer this. There's a question from Megan asking, does using language as strong as lie and liar get through to the progressives we want to detransition ideologically, or does it make them defensive and unwilling to consider our position? Anyone want to, I mean, this is one of the really key questions, I think, that we encounter. Anyone want to?
I would be happy to weigh in really quickly and then hand it off. So what I would say, I think these are maybe pulling on two comments that I made, the one about detransitioning ideologically and the other about, you're never forced by social media regulations or anything else to participate in a lie, although maybe the language of lie and liar was coming up elsewhere. I think the most important thing when reaching out to progressives who we want to go through this process of ideological detransition is not that we make bold statements, but that we use clear language and that we invite them to keep thinking out loud to define the terms like Kara was talking about, like, okay, transgender woman, what does that mean? Transgender, what does that mean? What do these people have in common if we're talking about, Bruce Jenner and Kira Bell and, a 3-year-old kind of girly boy, like, what do these people have in common that we would call them by the same name? I think that asking those questions, and I think that just creating a space for people to use language that's not policed in any direction as they're trying to figure this out is really important. To say to fellow progressives, you don't have to say whatever you're going to say perfectly. Like, I'm not out to get you, but I just want to think about this out loud. And that's how I would talk to progressives, rather than going in with something like, well, there are men who are lying about being women.
Anyone else want to say anything about that? I think just quickly from me, I think the use of the term liar, for me, it was one of those like kind of moments of revelation, and I would be more inclined to use that with other women to really clarify exactly what's going on. And I think sometimes that the kind of clarity that brings is so exhilarating that it's very movement building, and it helps to build a movement. And ultimately, I think it's the force of that movement that will change things, rather than persuading our enemies. I personally think. Was there another, where was the other Q&A question? Let me see. Lauren says, she gives a couple of quotes. She gives a quote, "I don't hate trans people, but I've noticed that a lot lately by our supposed allies. Is there any defense for prefacing remarks with this?" Anyone want to answer that question from Lauren? Kara?
Well, I want to hear Eliza's answer.
Okay.
It's Eliza.
What I would say is, do not put blood in the water by saying, I don't hate trans people. We don't hate trans people. This is about women's rights. The most important reframe that we have to do is to say, this isn't about trans, this is about sex. There is no need to apologize for the positions that we hold, and anytime we observe a taboo that has been connected to gender, anytime that we are apologizing for holding beliefs that everybody on earth held until 5 minutes ago, we are starting on the back foot.
Don't start on the back foot. Yeah, I agree. I would probably qualify that I don't see any need to assert either. We don't hate trans people. I wouldn't see any need to assert that. I mean, given the violation of women's spaces and bodies, and sometimes the destruction of women's lives, I think we're absolutely more than entitled to hate men who call themselves women. I think we're absolutely entitled, but I probably wouldn't even get into that discussion. I think I would keep to strictly speaking about the reality of sex.
And my critique is of an ideology, less of people. I'm not in people's heads. I don't have feelings towards most of these folks. I don't know them. And it's the ideology that I'm critical of and that I'm critiquing. It's not people as a group. It's what this ideology is doing to women's rights.
Can I jump in?
Amanda, I was just going to ask you, but ideology doesn't exist outside of people, does it? It doesn't exist outside. The ideology is only sort of perpetuated through individuals. It's not a kind of separate thing.
In certain respects, I mean, we were talking about young women before. There are, none of us believe in this, but trans children. I mean, though there are people who are part of an ideology who subscribe to this ideology, who are in their own way victims. And so my critique, I have no criticism of them as individuals, except for maybe particular actions that they take. But my problem is with the ideology that either they've subscribed to, or even worse, their parents have subscribed to, and what that ideology is doing to the systems in the world that we are trying to participate in, public life, public spaces, education, hospital wards, domestic violence shelters, prisons. My beef is with the ideology that some individuals are pushing and subscribing to, but it's not an individual critique until it is, in an individual circumstance.
Can I just very quickly say, this is one of my biggest challenges within the so-called gender critical movement. And it really bothers me when people say, I don't hate trans people, and the other one is, it's not transphobic to say blah, 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 blah. It's not transphobic to say that women have rights. I think that's really dangerous.
I think I completely agree, Kara. And I think it by using that kind of language, you're actually reifying the notion that there is such a thing as these mystical kind of trans people who are somehow miraculously, not the same as the rest of us in terms of having sex bodies. And obviously it's completely reifying and legitimizing the notion of transphobia, which of course we could just take that to pieces immediately. So it's kind of legitimizing it, which I think is I have seen this kind of split quite a lot about, I don't have an argument with trans people, but it's the ideology. But I would still say, trans people are making those claims. They are actually part of that. They are, perpetuating that ideology. You can't. I don't think you can separate. I don't think you can kind of separate the two. I'm sorry. I think Austin. I think we're out of time. Are we?
Yes. Thank you
I
so
wanted to
much.
go around. I wanted to go around and just ask everyone for final comments, but I don't think we've really.
That's okay. Let's do it. Let's do
time.
you want to do the final comments just real briefly? Go ahead.
Would everyone like just to say? I know we were slightly over time. Would just, if you want to, final chance to say anything that you haven't had the chance to say so far? If anyone has any comments.
Eliza, I think Eliza has to go soonest. So maybe if Eliza.
I just want to say thank you for a great discussion, and it's been, I'm really glad to be invited. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Eliza, for your really great contributions. Anyone else want to say some final comments?
I just really think that I think that any concession to the language of the enemy is a lost battle in a bigger war. I think any concession is dangerous, and I'm really interested in all of us holding the line for women and girls, and that's what we need to keep doing. And any concession on language makes it very difficult for us to do that. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Kara. Jesika, did you have any final comment?
The only thing I do want to say is that while I agree with everything you said about gender critical, it is a wishy-washy term, and I certainly don't use it for myself. I don't like it. There is no denying that it is one of mass appeal. And I only wish that in the United States, we might have some kind of a protection, even around gender critical, as you all have earned in the UK. That would be such a great benefit to us, even if it is a term we don't love. So I'm just throwing that out there, but because I don't think we're going to get that kind of a protection around, say, the term radical feminist. I think even in the UK, you'd be hard pressed to have legal protection around radical feminism. The patriarchy is never going to concede that. So I'm just putting that thought out there. That's all I wanted to say, but thank you so much for inviting me and having me. It's been a real pleasure and an honor.
Thanks, Jesika. Amanda, did you have any final thoughts?
I guess I would just mention this on July 4th. Our First Amendment might be our absolute greatest invention in America. And there are trickling in different parts of the country some different laws that are compelling speech and that are just facially unconstitutional. It's in San Francisco, it's in New York City. So I would just encourage people, if you're interested in this issue, to kind of keep your ears perked to that issue. None of them have really been percolating into cases yet, which is also interesting because some of them have been around for a while. I, as someone who's interested in the legal aspect of that, I'm interested in seeing where they go. And then I would just echo Kara's point on this, which is that we here are sort of the first line on this, and don't give on it.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. I've absolutely loved this conversation. It's been, in Mary Daly's phrase, it's been very inspiriting. I really feel my spirit rising with just hearing you all speaking so truthfully and with such conviction. It's been really fantastic. Thank you so much. So, Austin.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you so much, all the panelists. Enjoy the rest of your 4th of July. See you next time. Bye.